I'm not actually sporting a moustache yet for Movember because we pre-recorded this in October. Yes, October, the month before November. It's a really great podcast because we've got Tim and Olly on from the Eleos Partnership. We speak about their experiences with mental health, being service people within the army, how they dealt with it, how they overcame it, and where they're currently at now, and the path in which they're trying to cave within the world of mental health within larger organisations is a really, really great episode, and I think you're going to enjoy it. So over to you, Ben.
Welcome back to the Ottr Culture Podcast. You're joined with co-host Dan Pettit.
Yes.
And we have some special guests today, Olly Church and Tim Rushmere from Eleos Partnership.
Correct.
Cool. Guys, thank you for coming on. Today we're doing like a bit of a campaign around Movember, men's mental health. Wanted to get you guys on to kind of talk about, well, those things in particular. Your journey with mental health and the company that you then started because of it. So without further ado, do you guys want to give us a quick introduction to who you are and what you do?
Sure. Shall I go? So I spent about 12, 13 years in the Army, in the Royal Artillery, and absolutely no awareness of what mental health was. Had a pretty good early career, but I did have an early experience that then it was a traumatic experience, caused some sort of inner conflict, and I just went on for sort of 10 years or so, just parking it, moving on, going again. When I had a dip, regather myself, push myself again, and so on. And then really interestingly, I had in about December 2015, I started getting these feelings that something's about to go wrong. And I actually spoke to a colleague of mine who's the sort of chief of staff and said, I can't really explain this. I feel like something's about to go wrong. And I'd assumed I'd just drop a project at work or something, and it was outward facing. He didn't really understand what that was. Went on Christmas leave, came back, and about 2 days after I came back, I just hit the floor. Like massive sort of acute panic attack, Q breakdown, 3 diagnoses, end of story at work, 18 months sick leave, and then I suppose that's the end of phase 1 of my journey. And that's when I started to realise that what mental health was, what poor mental health was, connected it with a lot of those experiences that I had over that 10 years. But genuinely, that was really the moment that I had that initial understanding.
Was it like a gut feeling? What was?
Yeah,
is this something that you feel within inside then?
Yeah, absolutely. And clearly it was a form of acute anxiety that it had built up, and that anxiety, I guess, had built up over that 10-year period. But absolutely gut-based feeling, and of course, consciously, you're trying to find an explanation for that. Mm-hmm. And our mind's very good at finding evidence to support our thinking. But if you can't clarify your thinking, then you're constantly going to bring false evidence into play and false scenarios. So that's why I think it was going to be, the dropping of a project or the missing of a deadline. I couldn't cope with the workload, that sort of thing. But my gut, my body, my mind were indicating to me that I was about to pile in.
Did your colleagues around you, did they notice
the
shift still change?
No, not at all.
Because to the outset, you were still Tim. You were just normal. They couldn't see anything going on inside.
Yeah. And I'd only been there for about 5-6 months. New team, etc. So that comes into play. But you'll probably mention this as well, Olly. But we had in the organisation a really low level of understanding what mental health was. There was no formal education and stuff. So of course that has a part to play. It doesn't really set other people up to be able to observe declines in people.
Yeah.
And I had no inner ability to recognise that myself. So, logically, that all makes sense, doesn't it? That those scenarios can play out that way.
Mm.
Yeah.
And for yourself, Olly?
Yeah, so what Tim didn't mention is that we actually joined the Army together nearly 20 years ago, probably about the time you were born, Ben. So we joined the Army, went our separate ways. I did tours of Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland. And in 2010, my luck sort of ran out. I've always been quite accident prone, and I ended up treading on an explosive device in Afghanistan. And I was lucky. It was pretty much the bomb maker's bad day. They say in car factories there's always like a Friday. You got that car built on a Friday. I think the bomb that I trod on was built on a Friday. But it left me with a shattered foot, a bit of a brain injury, which still has the odd impact on me, but largely sort of got to grips with it. And so I had to leave the Army. And I then moved over to the civil service, and really what impacted me was probably not the trauma in the way that Tim was impacted, because I never developed PTSD, but I think it was more depression and anxiety. And when I think back, it was probably due to leaving the army in a way that was not on my own terms. So what most soldiers will feel is that they develop a really strong sense of identity, a really strong sense of connection with the people around them, and a really strong sense of purpose. And all of those are really, really good protective factors for our mental health. And so we can be robust. We can just keep going when, as Tim did, when things are going wrong around you, people are getting injured, people are getting killed. Actually, together you move forward and you look after each other. But the moment you leave that environment, your identity is gone. Your connection with those people is largely severed. And that sense of purpose is frankly, disappeared. But you don't necessarily notice those things expanding. It's a bit like a balloon blowing up. This protective cushion around you that when you leave, it deflates. But nobody tells you it's going to deflate. And nobody tells you that you have to re-inflate it with something else. You've got to find that identity. You've got to be you. You've got to have that connection with other people around you. You've got to re-establish that sense of purpose. And so I think that's where my depression, my anxiety, my suicidal thoughts were really generated from. And a bit like Tim, my knowledge around mental health was very limited, because in the army, as soon as you mentioned the word mental health, it's right, like, let's get the doctor involved, let's get the medical chain involved. And so the ability for the leadership to be proactive about it, and this is when we were serving. I think it's getting better now. I think a lot of work has been done. But the leadership, essentially, it's taken out of their hands. But also, the emphasis on welfare of the soldiers is definitely there, but it's always been from a slightly sort of vague perspective. It's about making sure that people are sort of looked after generally. And it was never about developing awareness or knowledge or a culture around mental health. And so I think that's where, I wouldn't say I was let down. I just think it's how society is, isn't it? And the army is just a reflection of society in many ways. And so, I because I had no knowledge, I couldn't really identify what was going on. So I knew something was up, a bit like Tim, but I couldn't make that connection. And eventually, and actually really importantly, neither could people around me. So they could probably see something was up. But nobody either had the knowledge or the confidence to approach me and say, Ollie, I think you might be depressed. Therefore, go and see the doctor. And, what we talk about absolutely is having the right conversation at the right time with the right person. Do that as early as possible. And actually, many of these issues can be solved, through leadership, through management, through friendship, rather than having to be medicalized.
Do you both think that depending on your rank in the military, it makes it harder to admit you need help? Would you say that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I'd agree with that to a certain extent. I think this awareness comes into play again because the way I related to my experiences was just that it was to be expected in response to what I was working on at the time. It wasn't a mental health thing. I didn't identify it like that at that stage. But I think certainly from a military perspective, if you're in a position of leadership, which is effectively selfless service, you don't put yourself first, that type of scenario, you tend to not really pay attention to yourself like you should do. Certainly not in a way that is socially recommended now. People are out there on LinkedIn sharing these sorts of insights that you need to prioritize self-care and so on. Culturally, we didn't really do that as leaders, regardless of rank. It wasn't really in our psyche. So the whole self-care thing came across, I think, through that 10-year period for me as a nice to have if I had time and space. But it wasn't my first thought because you're focused on other people. As you go up through ranks, and I didn't get very far, I went sort of 2 or 3 up. You probably double down on that mentality to a certain degree, But I think to a certain extent, if you promote to a point where you feel settled, and I'm sort of achieving my aims here in this organisation, then, I mean, I've seen evidence in this area with friends, you probably do start to settle. You probably do start to look after yourself a little bit better. But in the early years, I think it just naturally comes across as a bit of a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So you were saying, Ollie, about how you came out of the army and you started suffering with depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts and stuff like that. Did you ever have that prior to, or when you were in the army? Did you ever have those feelings, or was it something that it was obviously that kind of accident that triggered that?
Yeah.
Was it awareness of a younger, I feel like as young men, and I've had it myself, that I'm sometimes I feel indestructible. I've never had these thoughts and feelings.
Oh, yeah.
And if we speak to the guys, it's something that we've joked about, is that I've always been the guys like, I don't really think I have that.
Yeah.
And is that something, does it take something to do it, or do we all have it? We just don't notice those feelings.
And that's the difficulty, is that the factors involved in our mental health, whether that's positive or negative, is really, really complex. And it's funny that you talk about the invincibility, because I think there is a thing, particularly in younger men, where it's like, nothing can touch me. I remember actually 3 days before I got blown up, I took a machine gun bullet through the side of my rucksack, bounced off my body armor. I'm like, yeah, nobody can get me.
I think the irony is you probably thought you were bomb-proof.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you went into the next day thinking,
Yeah, and I was really just keen that my wife didn't find out. So yeah, there is that invincibility, but there's also that support of people around you. This sort of, I come from a very strong family regiment, and still very, very much in touch with people from it. And there's this really tight bond, which does protect your mental health.
Yeah.
And I think there is also, the folly of youth. As an old man now, I can probably say that. And as life goes on, it does get more complex. You potentially get more risk factors involved. You get more. It's maybe harder because of other commitments to maintain the protective factors, things that are going to look after our mental health. But for me, there was the added complexity of there was a brain injury. It affected the part of my brain which regulates emotion, for example. So that was really difficult, and I've built coping mechanisms around that. Largely through things like meditation, which is something that I would never have believed could have an impact. Because I think, like a lot of people, I got to a point where I was really depressed, really anxious, and thought, right, I just need medication to fix me. And that's definitely part of the answer for some people at various stages. But actually, a lot of it was realizing that I had to do a lot of work on myself, on how I thought, on how I lived my life. And that's something that again was a big realization, was that actually, and we talk about this idea of mental fitness, and we liken it to physical fitness. So, if you want to get fit, you can come to me and say, right, come and tell me how to do this, motivate me, give me a training plan, run alongside me. But ultimately, I can't go for a run for you. And a lot of this stuff we have to do for ourselves. And that's really, really difficult to accept if you're already, quite a long way down on that mental health continuum, and you're already feeling, feeling in a bad space. And that's really difficult.
Do you think if you hadn't stepped on it that day, do you think you think your journey would have been the same, or do you think that when it happened, it just sped the process up?
I think that was, it's one of those sliding door moments, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where it triggered a chain of events, which, I could not have predicted. But also, I didn't necessarily plan it that well. I was really lucky. As I said, my injuries were pretty minimal. But they're also, unlike a traumatic amputation, which is a really difficult thing to experience. And, I know a number of people who are still dealing with that. My sort of challenge has been a lot more subtle. So I mentioned to you, Ben, since I last saw you, I've started going deaf in my left ear and got tinnitus and, a little bit of vertigo and imbalance. And it's just these things, it's this point that actually adversity will continue to show up in our lives to a greater or lesser extent. And actually, I've got to this point where actually I'm far better able to deal with this stuff than I would have done if it hadn't happened, for example. So in a way, talk about sort of speeding up this process. I was really good at, in the army, being robust, which is, I think, subtly different from being resilient. Because robust, you just carry on, as Tim talked about. But being emotionally resilient is about understanding what affects your mental health and understanding that there are risk factors which are going to negatively affect it. There are protective factors which are going to, keep it positive. And it's about understanding and identifying these things and planning your life accordingly. But nobody really teaches us that as we grow up, do they?
No, exactly. I wonder how different military careers would be if the support and the understanding was there from the get-go. If that was bred within the culture from the ground up, because from an outsider it looks so painfully obvious that needs to be there.
Yeah. I think it is. I think they're getting a lot better.
I think the argument for that is clear, and we keep coming back to the idea of awareness, and the reason that that's so important is that really that's the foundation. So awareness and self-knowledge are the foundation that set you up for development of insight that are personal to you, which sets you up to develop intention to make some changes, or develop ways of being more emotionally agile, more flexible in the way you live your life. And all that comes prior to the potential for you to take action. And ultimately, as Ollie, you go back to mental fitness, that is about applied learning. That is about taking action that makes a difference to you in your life. And of course, any sort of informal or structured or formal education, which is what I tend to call an upstream approach. So we're more proactive and preventative than we are responsive and reactive. That is going to give people the opportunity to start building awareness, to identify these little nuggets of information that help them make sense of experiences they've had, and do what we call is the connecting of the dots. And the connecting of the dots is the generation of insights where you start piecing together past experience or current experience, and that sets you up to directly influence how you experience life. And I think, I would say soldiers and service people are pretty agile and flexible in how they approach their work and how they live their lives. But arguably, the development of more emotional agility will be a huge advantage, to people in service and arguably in any walk of life.
Yeah.
But I think we should recognise that there is a lot of good work going on in the military and specifically the army. But this stuff doesn't change overnight. What we talk about is this sort of realisation that we came to, that this has got to be a shared responsibility between the organisation. So it's got those policies, those processes, that training, the education in place. It's the leaders making sure that actually you're living by those by that ethos, and that you give sufficient attention to it. You give people the time, the space, the permission to explore this stuff, but also the individual. As I said earlier, there's a lot of this stuff that we can't do for other people. And that's the hardest thing to do in many cases when you're already experiencing poor mental health, is to take that responsibility, because other people can see it. And that's why, recovery can take a long, long time, because things have to start lining up. There are things that you can do to accelerate it by understanding what's going to contribute to a good recovery. Recovery for many people is ongoing throughout life.
Yeah, it's really interesting you said about connecting the dots, Tim, because when I had my bouts of anxiety, the worst part was always not knowing why it was happening and what it was.
It's scary, isn't it?
Scary, and because I couldn't control it, that made it 10 times worse. And it's only after experience of going through it, understanding what my triggers were and how it would affect my anxiety, I started to think, okay, I think I can have a grasp on this now because I know why it's happening.
Yeah.
And then it led me to the point of like reaching out, asking for help. And I remember I spoke to a friend about it, and they said, and it's always stayed with me, the line she said, she goes, mental health is not a life sentence, and that really helped get me out of the pit that I was in, because I was thinking, because the anxiety was so high, I thought, this is it now, this is my life forever.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it wasn't, and it did end. But it's not like you break a leg, it's like, all right, 6 weeks, go put your leg up, you'll be fine. It's like, no one really knows how long it's going to take you. Everyone's different. You just have to kind of go through this journey.
But the reality is that the human brain, human mind are really, really adaptable, aren't they? They are flexible, they're malleable, but we've got to get them in the right position to receive the right information, to get into those right habits. Because, as you say, anxiety is something that is very, very physical. Tim sort of talked about it earlier, and it's scary, and anxiety makes you anxious.
Yes, it's a vicious circle.
It is. It's really vicious.
Yeah.
And so actually, bringing a degree of awareness, a bit of consciousness to it, to recognize it in yourself, and then to understand what you can do. For me, that's really what resilience is about. Resilience is not about keeping on going, until you fall over, which is what we both did. That's a degree of robustness, which the army traditionally has been really, really good at developing, because people need to carry on in difficult situations. But that resilience is about adapting our lifestyles, changing what we do and when we do it, so that we can, if you want to call it, perform sustainably in our professional and our personal lives. And that's something, I probably wouldn't have if I hadn't trodden on that device, because I probably just would have carried on this mindset. Possibly I'd still be in the army. Possibly I would have experienced depression for all sorts of other reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a family history of bipolar. Don't think I have that, but that could have happened. All of these things come into play.
Do you think mental health issues as a whole is becoming more common, or do you think the awareness has just increased to a point now where the conversations are there and these issues have always existed?
The first part of that, I've always found it actually quite difficult to form a view, or certainly express a view. But I think over the last couple of years, for slightly different reasons, we've seen evidence of a lot more people relating to what mental health is, in either a personal or collective context. And there's always been, I think, with many people, an assumption that the term mental health is automatically a negative thing.
Yeah.
That it indicates that it is poor mental health, and it's not. It's just an expression of the state of your mental health, and it can be positive or negative. But whether the prevalence is increasing, I'm not sure. Of course, there's a positive somewhere hidden in that, which is if people are more aware and therefore connecting their own dots, and that leads to them getting to the point they realise actually there is something that's problematic and I need help with something, they may go on to get a diagnosis, and therefore they're going to contribute to the stats, but almost in a positive way.
It's all awareness then, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's difficult to form a completely balanced view on this. I think people have always experienced poor mental health. So I found out relatively recently that my great-grandfather was essentially locked up in a lunatic asylum for the majority of his life.
Wow.
And it was probably bipolar, but that's how they dealt with it then. So I think people have always experienced it. I think there were probably large sections of our society that experienced some kind of post-traumatic stress after world wars, for example. And it manifested itself in all sorts of different things, in all sorts of different ways. So I think it's always been there. I think people are more willing to talk about it, explore it, and maybe actually recover in a way that people, didn't recover in the past. They just try to carry on and use drugs or alcohol to self-medicate, or even sadly took their own lives. But what I would say on top of that is that actually, I think increasingly in the 21st century, we're living in a way in which we're not designed for. We don't move that much, do we? And it's very easy to sit down most of the day. Most of us work in a sort of sedentary environment. We're designed to move. That's a really good natural way of getting rid of a lot of the stress hormones, stress chemicals in our bodies. We're not designed for the information overload, which is just getting more and more. We're designed apparently to know about 100 people, so the people in our tribe or our village, not these tens of thousands of people that we apparently know on Facebook or Instagram or whoever it is, because we're not really good at dealing with this feeling of being judged or comparing ourselves to hundreds of thousands of other people. And that's where social media has got a lot of good stuff about it. But it's also really potentially damaging, isn't it? So all of these things are fundamentally at odds with how we are designed, and therefore I think present risk factors. So that's why I think, particularly after the pandemic, a lot of people have tried to simplify their lives, haven't they? They maybe cut out social media. They maybe trying to connect with people in real life, maybe more than they are virtually. So I think those are the sorts of things that we just need to bear in mind.
It's a bit of a catch-22, social media, isn't it? Because it connects the world and it brings a lot of good, but equally, I don't even know how you begin to fix that judgment side of it, that feeling of being judged, because how do you escape that? You can't really. That's like the human mindset, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I find really interesting is there is so much opportunity in understanding mental health, so that in an individual context, someone can they can influence their experience of life and their personal lives more directly. And of course, even though there are benefits of connection, which we've talked about being really important, if society is setting us up in a way where we become overly reliant on external factors, that on paper is at odds with elements of our inner dialogue, our inner narrative, and what we call the internal locus of control that we need. That is a position where we believe to our core that we can directly influence our circumstances. But actually elements of society and social media in particular, they're constantly teasing us away from retaining a high internal locus of control and externalize it, where we become more dependent on external validation. And if we're more dependent on external validation, and I experienced this in some unfavorable ways during my recovery, you are more vulnerable to that judgment that potentially might come the other way. You open yourself up to the world because you're looking at it and you're hoping for positive feedback, supportive viewpoints, but you can get the absolute opposite. I don't know if you guys have sort of experienced that, Ben, from a anxiety perspective, but could you relate to when you're experiencing it, feeling increasingly open to judgment from other people, even though you didn't need it?
I think I've been lucky in the fact that I've felt like I've carried a sort of superpower in the fact that I don't really care what anyone thinks about me.
Okay, brilliant.
Which has amazing perks, and there are some disadvantages to that. But definitely when I experienced anxiety, it was, and I started to open up about it, there was definitely a fear of being judged.
Yeah.
And I hadn't really experienced that with anything before, so that, which just made it worse. And then also the way, I guess, society is built up, I was much younger then, I was about 21, 28 now, so I guess I'm still young. But the way society is built up, it kind of makes you feel that by admitting that there's something wrong, you're kind of admitting that you're broken and there's something wrong with you when there's not, And I think it's almost the way my mindset is completely switched now by, if you haven't experienced necessarily anything wrong mental health, I think that's more unnormal. Because I think like poor mental health or problems of mental health, I think makes you human in a way, in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And just understanding that
it's
part of our makeup. It's part of why we've evolved and survived as a species.
Yeah.
Because we have this negativity bias. Quite often we will rush to see the worst case scenario so that we can plan for it. We can protect, we can prepare. That's really useful if there's a saber-toothed tiger that's after you. It's not really that relevant in many of the cases in modern life, is it? We're lucky enough to live in a pretty peaceful country. It's everyday life for us is pretty safe, isn't it? So actually, again, that's part of that calibration for the 21st century. We're still designed to be protecting ourselves in caves against tigers, and that can be really useful. But if it sits there in our subconscious without us recognizing it and challenging it, that's where we get that really unhelpful, what we might call thinking distortions, where we think, shit, life is about to collapse, when actually we just didn't get as many likes for our post on LinkedIn as we were hoping to.
When you've been dealing with these feelings, you've obviously you may or may not have had support from outer people or people, your loved ones and stuff like that. But also as like a recommendation, are there ways that you can support people who are feeling, not good? Because we spoke heavily here about our feelings and how it's affected us, but how can you help or support a loved one? Because I've got loved ones who've dealt with these things themselves, and I found it the hardest thing to try and, what do I say? What do? You can tell them that, everything's going to be fine. But to them, that's like probably don't want to hear that.
Yeah, I think.
So what's the best way?
I mean, I think to a certain extent, people need to be ready. I mean, we've already talked about a lot of the challenges there. So, what's going on for that person, particularly in an event where it's the first time they experience something that they're struggling with. We talked about the need of awareness and the fact that we're capable of pushing on for something like 10 years and more, and still not really develop that. That's a challenge. The fact that someone's locus of control might be quite externally focused is another challenge. You've got inner conflict, inner dialogue to wrestle with. There's that fear of judgment. There are so many complicating factors that are intertwined that make it hard for that person not only to recognise what might be going on and relate it, to something, mental health. But back to what Ollie said earlier, quite often people simply need what we simplify as time, space, and permission in order to get to the point they generate those insights, in order to connect the dots. If that makes sense and is not too drawn out. Because, as you say, Dan, it's difficult to support someone if they're not on top of that stuff, because they're effectively not ready. They're not open to it, and for good reason sometimes. Quite often people are very much aware, like I was, of a sense of something building physically within, and that translates to a sense of fear of that thing actually coming out. And so automatically we put those coping mechanisms back in place. We push that thing back down. But over the long term, that does us quite a lot of damage. So we've got to support people through the natural tendency to not want to let stuff surface, as well as all the other factors that are involved as well. But the bottom line is, if you've got a good, I say network, but a good number of virtuous connections around you, whether that's family, friends, trusted work colleagues, whoever it is, that is the best possible scenario to help someone get to the point where you can help them. So the need for psychological safety is a key one.
Yeah, and not for that feeling of not being judged. And I think it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but actually sometimes just listening. Yeah. Just being very, very clear that you are there to listen, you're there to hear them, because actually, particularly if we can, address this stuff sooner rather than later, quite often what we're doing by talking is dragging all these feelings, thoughts out of our subconscious, where we tend to think about things irrationally, fear-based, illogically, catastrophically. We've all had that waking up in the middle of the night, haven't we? Something which is, we look at it the next day is nothing. But that's because our conscious brain is asleep. Our subconscious, some people call it the chimp brain, that is what is overactive. And the minute that we can challenge that and switch to the conscious brain, which is rational, which is logical, which is far calmer, that's when actually, just by talking, by letting these things out, that's when we start to make sense of it. And maybe that was part of your experience.
I think you hit the nail on the head, yeah.
Yeah. Because, the human brain is a really complex thing, and I wouldn't profess to understand it in any great detail. But it's about, I think, looking at it not necessarily from an academic, a clinical, or a sort of medical perspective, but it's just thinking, right, how does this relate to me? How do I challenge that inner critic? How do I challenge that negativity bias? But also just realizing that as humans, most of us are going through this to a greater or less extent. And that, just reassuring people. What you don't want to do is get into a competition saying, oh yeah, I've felt like that. But what I've found is that simply getting out, maybe going for a walk, you side by side, you don't have that, eye to eye thing, which can put people off, can't it?
Yeah.
If I stare at you, Ben,
tell me your feelings.
Exactly. It's about keeping it light, keeping it quite matter of fact. I've found actually often helps.
Yeah.
Just saying, actually that's not that weird. I've had those sort of thoughts.
Yeah.
What you don't want to be doing necessarily straight away is offering solutions, because we probably can't directly fix what's going on. We can maybe take some of the burden, but and I learnt this with my wife. It only took me about 15 years to work it out.
Oh, we're getting insight here.
Yeah, when she comes at the end of the day and unloads, because women typically are better at this sort of stuff. When she's doing that, she doesn't want my brilliant ideas on how to fix stuff. What she wants to do is to be heard, and that's great. But as men, we like to fix things. Typically we like to do that, and there can be a time for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think again, that coming back to that sense of permission. If you were talking to me, Dan, and you were telling me about the fact that you were depressed, I might say, listen to you, how are you feeling? How long have you felt like that? If I was really worried, I might ask you directly whether you'd thought about taking your own life. If I thought that was a risk, because we know that is actually the most important thing to do, is to confront these things.
And asking it's quite a brutal question. It feels like, but by them talking about that will, by them addressing it, does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I've done that on a number of times, number of occasions. But it's scary, isn't it? And I always, there's some great free training out there. The Zero Suicide Alliance. There's some free online training, which just, is about ultimately not avoiding the really difficult but potentially tragic outcome of not asking those questions. Sorry, to go back to my sort of earlier point, but I might get to the point, say to you, Dan, look, I've experienced depression in the past. Would it be useful to hear my experience and to hear what helped me? And you might be at a point where actually you're not ready for that, or you might think, actually, wow, I'm not the only one who's been through this. Somebody has come out the other side.
That helped me.
And that's really useful.
Yeah.
And the important thing here is that we don't have to be experts, do we? A lot of it is about some good basic knowledge, which again is freely available. It's about the right intention, mostly, that lack of judgment, and an understanding that the reason that I think we've got to where we are in society, it is getting better, but where it is a taboo, is because there's this massive gap between ignorance around mental health, where, let's face it, most of society probably still is, and that expertise of psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, who are really, really important. But actually there's a massive gap, isn't there? And there's a fear of stepping from the ignorance towards the expertise. And so that's really, what we try and do is, we're not experts, we're not clinically qualified, but what we are aware of is that actually those early conversations in a supportive, informed way are actually what we need as a society.
It's normalization, isn't it? It's I've had something similar recently where my wife is 8.5 months pregnant, and people have asked me along the way, like, are you shitting yourself? You're worried? All this sort of stuff. I'm
nervous, anxious, worried?
Yeah. And I'm thinking, the whole time I'm thinking, like, not at all.
Yeah.
I'm not at all. But I guess my mindset has always been, this is literally one of the most normal things I can do as a person, is to have a child.
But it's the reason you're on Earth, isn't it?
Literally. And I can't think of a single thing that is more common than having kids, when you think about it.
Yeah.
And I guess that's why I've always been, oh yeah, okay, well, I'm just going to take it as it comes. And then it got to the point I was thinking, I started to feel guilty, like, oh my, should I be worried about this? Should I feel nervous about it? And then obviously that was the chimp brain talking to me. And then logically I'm like, no, Ben, this is completely, you feel how you want to feel.
But it's that contagious fear from other people.
Yes, exactly.
Fear is contagious, but also so is courage and calmness and all that sort of stuff.
I've listened to an interview with you before, or maybe it was on the intros on your website, and you spoke about how you went from commanding 100 soldiers to then obviously getting injured and feeling all these feelings. But when you are commanding a group of soldiers, do you have to go as a leader? Do you have to go out and do you have to notice signs that some people aren't in a better place or they aren't in a good place? How do you do that when you're in the field, when you're in Afghanistan or you're in Iraq? How do you do these things?
So, I mean, I'll answer this relatively instinctively, so it's real. But I think there are two things that jump out for me. I think that the first one is that back to that idea of sort of selfless commitment, which I think comes with any sort of leadership position, and that can be as much as a parent, as a some sort of leader at work or a leader in the field in the military, and. On paper, it's completely logical that we don't really have the capacity for others unless we're on top of our own stuff, or we have that sort of outward-facing mindset. That is what allows us to pick up on the signs of where someone is at, whether it's, you know, an improvement or it's a decline. So I think, you know, those observation skills are a product of your mindset and how you position yourself as some sort of leader, whether that's, you know, in an army context, in barracks, or in the field, in any situation. I think it's consistent to all scenarios. And then the second one, of course, is knowing your people. So you know, we can't observe change in people unless we have reference points. Mm-hmm. And logically, that is, you need to know your people and you need to know them well. And, you know, there are examples that we've come across in organizations where psychological safety is at a level that people are sort of buddying up, or they're working in close teams, and there's trust, and they look out for each other. And they've gone to the point where they said, I have a tendency to sometimes feel like this, or I have a history of depression. If I go into a dip, this is what you're likely to see in me. Would you let me know if you start seeing that? Because it's really difficult at times when I'm on that decline to know and to pick it up myself. So that's a really, really good example of where if the culture is right and the level of connection is right, people can put very basic things in place that are really, really effective.
And I guess other people, you know, that's not just military, that can be done within any workplace. Absolutely. With any group of people.
Absolutely.
Right? A team, a sports team, whatever.
Yeah. It comes back to this idea of needing psychological safety and trust in place in order to get to that point. Yeah. And which is why connection is so important.
Yeah, and a lot of organisations have that naturally, coincidentally, because of good leadership, because people get on well, because people share values. But there'll be other situations, other scenarios where there is poor leadership. People don't like each other. People don't have aligned values. Where, you know, and those are the ingredients of probably, you know, low levels of psychological safety. People not feeling comfortable about sharing, you know, things that are going on, and therefore probably just compounding their own mental health because they don't feel that they can be honest, or they don't think anything's going to be done. And there are mechanisms that you can use to sort of force that, not force it, but encourage it, build it. And then, you know, even where it exists coincidentally, naturally, organically, you know, there are other things that we can do to reinforce it, because the danger is that if something is happening organically, but, you know, there might be huge levels of psychological safety, but we don't even know what the concept means. Mm. So actually, if we have it coincidentally, then I would say it's at risk potentially if, you know, a poor leader comes in of fragmenting. And that's why I think it's always useful to bring these concepts into teams, into organisations, so that actually we can proactively work towards it. But it's tough. It really is. You know, as you know, it only takes one individual as part of a team who may be experiencing poor mental health, who may be just a difficult character. Because let's face it, some people just are difficult. It could be, you know, that sort of that leader who comes in who's hugely ambitious for themselves, doesn't really care about anybody else. So all of those things potentially come in, don't they? And they can threaten psychological safety. And it takes decisive leadership action, but also contribution from the rest of the team. I talked about this shared responsibility. You know, it can't solely rest in the hands of a leader. Mm. Everybody's got to buy into it. Everybody's got to see the benefits and see that actually if you want a team that is going to perform well, perform sustainably, individually and collectively, actually that's really the key factor there, isn't it? Because if we feel safe as a team, we get to do our best work. Mm-hmm. We get to reach our potential. But that bad apple, you know, wherever they come from, potentially puts it at risk.
Yeah, so I think in my mind, linked to this idea, there are two key references or models that I use to make an assessment of where a collective is at, or where a team is at. And the first one is you come across the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Mm-hmm. So he talks about 3 levels. So he talks about dependence, independence, and interdependence. And so the way I relate to that is, if you can recognize that there are people in your team who are dependent upon you, it potentially suggests that their locus of control is quite external. And And what we're aiming for is that people have got the competence, the confidence, and the skills to be emotionally independent. And that's what sets a team up to be interdependent, which is potentially taking that level, as I said before, where people will openly share that sort of degree of detail that actually helps the collective grow and go to the next level. And then the second one is just referring to what we call the 4 levels of psychological safety. So what we don't want is we don't want people to feel excluded. So that's at sort of level 0. Our first aim is that they feel included. If they feel included, they can go on to effectively contribute more. So we call it contributor safety. Learner safety. Safe to learn, safe to make mistakes. Then contributor safety. They're in a position where they can give more, receive more. So does that make sense? You're going up through these levels, and ultimately the top level is challenger safety, where you can practically, objectively challenge each other under the right sort of vibe without people getting upset and focusing back in on themselves. Yeah. So, I think the preference is probably the simplified dependent, independence, interdependence idea. But for me, it totally makes sense in the subject area of mental health and connecting teams.
But it's really difficult, isn't it? Because you can be leading a team and just assume that there is psychological safety there, that everybody feels comfortable to challenge you. But unless you discuss this stuff in an open, matter-of-fact way, you could have individuals in that team sitting in that exclusion zone. Now, that might be as a result of the actions of other members of a team. It could be something that they are experiencing in their own mental health. And that's a really interesting point that you made about the locus of control. Because, I went from having a very, very strong internal locus of control. I had control over the course of my life. What I did what I did led to my results. All of those sorts of things really, having that sense of autonomy and control, to having a completely externalized locus of control. When I was really low, just thinking nothing that I could do is going to make a difference. This is never going to get better. This sense of permanence where I'm like, I'm going to feel like this forever if I haven't killed myself.
Like you mentioned, Ben.
Yeah.
That sense of I write myself off, this is the end.
And so these things can compound. They can get worse. And that is where I think the leader needs to understand, okay, where are we at? Where do you feel on this sort of zones of psychological safety? Okay, if you're low down on that, what can we do? What can you do to improve that, to increase it? Because, any decent leader wants people to be in that space of at least contributor safety, if not challenger safety, where people feel comfortable. Because that's the job of a leader, isn't it? The job of the leader is not to have all of the answers. The job of the leader is not to control everything. It's actually about getting everybody into a good space where they can do their best.
It's also a fantastic business metric. Like if your team are all feeling good and chirpy and happy, you're going to get the best out of them and the best work. So it really should be a metric that's focused on when you think about it. But moving on to our next point, what you guys ended up doing together and starting Eleos. Tell us a bit about that.
We could come at this a number of ways.
Have you heard of Rose Farm?
Yes.
As a new parent, you will
end up going there a lot.
Yeah, spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, I remember being there as a kid.
How did this?
There you go. For those people who don't live in the Greater Swindon area, Rose Farm is a like a kids' play farm. I don't know what you call them. But
it's a rave for kids, isn't it? Really.
Exactly.
So what year was this? This was probably 2017,
16, 17, something.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we just happened to bump into each other at Rose Farm. I would say dragging, but no, in reality, being dragged about by our kids. And we happened to both be in a similar place. We were both at some stage of recovery, having left the army, not really knowing, well, me personally, not knowing which way was up, going through a period of drifting and trying to figure out what on earth was going on. And that was the first time we'd seen each other since we went through training together in 2003-04.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Did you instantly recognise each other?
I think
Did
you
see
recognised
Tim walking?
me. I think I was looking at the ground, probably. yeah, or hiding in the ball pit.
Yeah. We were probably both a bit fatter and a bit greyer than we had been in those the glory days of our invincible youth.
And then you started Eleos together. Was the conversation started there?
My memory's a little bit grainy of this period because I was still dealing with a lot of my own stuff.
I was probably about a year ahead, I guess.
Yeah.
Something like that.
But I think, we recognise that we're in a similar position. We're going through the same sort of challenges, or had different experiences that led to those. And to be honest, that was probably the first time where I felt that here is someone that can help me move forward in an effective way on the same path. And that's what we started doing. So started, obviously we reconnected, started sharing stories, started relating to common elements of our two different experiences, and realised that there are a lot of common elements to two very different experiences here. And that just led us towards the recognition that there might be something in this. Like, there must be a lot of insights and understanding that we have generated individually and collectively that we can use to help other people avoid these either protracted recoveries, or even better still, avoid these events happening in the first place. And although when we formed Eleos, we started in the sort of responsive space, so helping people from a sort of mental health first aid perspective, etc. I think we knew that the long-term aim was, right in those early stages, to get as far ahead of these challenges as possible and help people understand the huge opportunities that there were to proactively get ahead of the risk of those challenges appearing for people later on.
Yeah, and I think really what we do is we're trying to explore this sort of intersection of leadership and mental health, culture, mental health, whether that's in the workplace or in personal lives. And, ultimately, we spent a long time wrangling with this, didn't we? But, what's our purpose? And we ultimately came up with, essentially distilling our purpose into inspiring people to live and work better by giving them the opportunity to understand themselves and each other better. I remembered it.
Yeah, absolutely. and of course, what that implies is the taking of action at some point as well. So I can't remember what it was that you said, Ben, earlier, but it got me thinking about using what's already in place. What's the most normal, what's the most common thing. And one of those opportunities I think that we latched onto was the fact that people talk to each other, the fact they rely on connection. So any mechanism around communication, connection, relationships has to be the mechanism to develop that understanding, particularly of each other. And, we talk about normalizing conversations. In order to normalize conversations, potentially conversations need to be happening in the first place.
Yeah.
So I see that sort of stage 2. And that's really where we've got to is a point where, how we offer what we do out to organizations is based around existing leadership structures, and that they tend to exist, and the fact that people at work and in wider life talk to each other.
Yeah.
So why not talk about this stuff?
So it's fair to say that you're not trying to come in and change culture. You're trying to improve it or be an addition to.
Yeah, we're presenting in the way that we think is best the opportunities for cultures to organically and naturally evolve.
That's a good line, that.
By better understanding, some of the core concepts, and then building to a point where people are very clear on how they can use that knowledge and those opportunities to improve, their experience at work and in their wider lives. Yeah.
And the pandemic was, it was difficult for everybody, but what it gave us was an opportunity to stop and think. So we, together with other team members, have delivered literally thousands of live training sessions, giving people some knowledge over a Teams call in a classroom for 3, 6, even 8 hours at a time. That's, particularly when you're exploring something like mental health, that's a lot to take in, isn't it? Even 3 hours is you're getting bombarded with ideas. And we realize that actually, are people taking this knowledge and applying it? Or actually, are they so overwhelmed that they understand it, they appreciate it, they get it in the moment, but that manual goes in a drawer and probably stays there, doesn't it? So are you really having the impact on culture, on individual knowledge that you want to?
Like longevity of it.
Yeah, Exactly. And we realised that we probably weren't. We realised that live training is great in many, many ways, but around a topic potentially so difficult like mental health, you've got to gradually drip feed this stuff in. You can't just bombard people with facts, figures, concepts, ideas that blow their mind. Because let's face it, it blew my mind. It's like, well, this stuff makes sense, but what do I do with it? And, we've trained hundreds and hundreds of mental health first aiders. We still do. We think it's a great concept. But actually, there's a lot of mental health first aiders sitting out there going, I've got my qualification. What do I do with it? I sort of get it. But actually, we came to this realization that what teams need at the team level is that opportunity, the resources, the structure, and ultimately the confidence to talk about these things on a regular basis. Because we talked about the fact that there are existing leadership structures within organizations. Most organizations will have a hierarchy. There are also existing communication structures, whether that's the weekly meeting, whether that's the briefing that they have before or after a shift. So actually, why don't we use those? Why don't we give them bite-sized things to talk about together? Because, I can sit there and I can do my e-learning. I can click through, you've done this stuff, whether it's health and safety training, GDPR. You click through, and if you're anything like me, you just keep on taking the test until you pass it.
Yeah.
And then it's gone. So you're not really applying that in everyday life. And so, that's why we created the Genesis program, which is, and this is really the thinly veiled sales pitch. But it's this idea that actually you got to warm people up to this stuff. So the first session that you run for 20, 30 minutes, it can be really awkward because people don't feel necessarily that they want to talk. But the time you've done the fifth, the sixth session, actually it does start to become more normalized. People feel comfortable.
And I think something we've got to recognise is that not everyone feel this is for them. But regardless, if you can establish that collective alone environment, whatever the subject, there is a benefit to the wider environment and the wider culture. But I think the opportunity that we had through our experience and recovery was learning on the job.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to improve even how you navigate stages or the latter stages of recovery unless you've got the ability to sort of learn on the job and implement different things at different times that potentially make changes and be prepared to do that. And sometimes, particularly if someone's affected by something, that takes quite a lot of courage. Sometimes it feels like it's accidental. Sometimes you won't move forward until, with the benefit of someone else, they help you clarify how to move forward. But you don't, I think looking back at recovery, what I recognise is you don't learn how to recover before you start recovering, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You find yourself, you're in that process already. But
there's a lot of trial and error, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is not all about recovery, but...
Do you think we'll get to a stage where we can understand recovery before the incident happens?
Well, I think that's probably one of the embedded aims of what we're trying to achieve. It's by bringing this stuff as far upstream as possible and presenting this subject area as an opportunity. If you understand it better, there might be stuff for you now, but there will certainly be stuff for you in the future. And I think we've got to recognise that we were lucky in that we had the opportunity to individually learn and apply what we needed in order to move forward. But what we find in society now is that a lot of the things that have been going on in the last 2 years, they're very far away from us. We can't directly influence them. We've got to recognise that those are having, at a macro level, an effect on people, but they can't just, grab a bit of what's going on in Ukraine or grab a bit of, lockdown, etc., and just make those immediate changes, within their own life. They're seeping in, but it's not as simple as this is happening in my life. I know how to fix it.
Yeah.
So I think more and more people will see the opportunity, understanding some of the basics, in order to have the chance to apply some of this stuff when it affects them in any context.
What would you guys say is ultimate success for Eleos? If it was to be 2027 and you've kind of achieved everything you wanted to achieve with the company, let's say, what would that look like in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, so I think for me it is it is evidence that people feel different, i.e. the culture feels different. There's a really tangible, gut-based set of evidence that people get this, they benefit from it, they're starting to apply it. People are staying in companies, people are being attracted to companies because these cultures are evolving. And that's, I think, the way I understand it, a level up from just getting a positive case study back or some written feedback. It is that you can, within a company, you can feel the vibe is different.
Genuine impact then.
Absolutely, yeah. So more people moving from a sense of dependence to independence, and then that evidence of that interdependence.
Brilliant.
And the exciting thing for us is that we don't actually know necessarily what interdependence really looks like, organization by organization. Like the magic only happens on the other side. We set people up for success by giving them the structure and the resources, but I'm excited to hear about the future when organizations fully commit to this process and this evolution, and they start giving us evidence of how it's appearing a success for them that we couldn't have even anticipated. Yeah.
It'd be really interesting when that data comes out, where you have companies that have brought that on board and 5, 6 years, 5, 6, 7 years down the line saying, look, this is where we're at now. Staff turnover's way lower than it used to be. There's no churn anymore. We keep the same staff members on. People are happier.
Absolutely.
Culture's improved. Business has improved.
The narrative's very different.
Precisely, yeah. And I think, as selfish as it sounds, it will become a very, like I said earlier, a very important business metric where people think, okay, if we take care of mental health, we'll get 30% better production. Yeah. And I think it will come down to things like that. Yeah. Because it's going to affect the end product, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So metrics will come into it, and there seems to be this obsession with performance, and for good reason often. But often, that performance comes at a collective and certainly an individual cost. And I think if people are evidently coming out and measuring well-being as more of an input, that foundation that sets people up to, not only grow in a safe way without that degradation, but they can sustain themselves. Teams are, becoming stronger and stronger, not constantly breaking apart. That's a good indication that people are starting to shift their mindset organizationally, not away from performance, but they're at least recognizing the importance of the foundations of really good understanding of well-being that enables that performance.
Never thought that capitalism would be a main driver for mental health preparation.
But, it's interesting, isn't it, on the motivations of businesses, because most of them, it's going to be profit or shareholder dividends or whatever it is. But there's so obviously a humane or ethical reason for doing this stuff, isn't there? As well as that business metric or the profit-driven motive. And you talk about what a success looked like. For me, I think it's sort of widespread adoption and acceptance of this idea of the shared responsibility of the CEO, of the most junior member of an organization, saying, look, we've got to do this together. We all want to be mentally healthy, but none of us can do this on our own. We can't do it by just paying for an app for everybody, because it then pushes the incentive, the onus onto the individual. Right, we're just going to keep pushing you, but actually we're giving you an app so you can sort yourself out. It's not going to be by saying, right, we've trained 1 in 10 of our staff as mental health first aiders. It's a really good idea and it has a lot of benefit to it, but you are stovepiping, you're siloing knowledge amongst 10% of the population. Whereas actually what we're trying to do is decentralize, to almost democratize this access to the culture change, the knowledge, the education that is going to be beneficial. So without wanting to sort of go on about the army too much, I sort of liken it to this scenario that we faced in Afghanistan shortly after our arrival in there in 2006. Of the sort of particularly kinetic period. Started off as a shooting war, which we knew how to deal with. We typically knew how to deal with gunshot wounds. So death rate was pretty stable. The Taliban evolved. They started using explosive devices, and death rate shot up. So what the realization was that we didn't necessarily need more surgeons back in the main camp. Okay, what we needed to do was, first of all, not tread on the devices in the first place. So equipping people with metal detectors and the knowledge to find them at the lowest level. And then if somebody did tread on one, what we needed is knowledge at the lowest level of how to deal with a traumatic amputation, so we can then stabilize, get them extracted to that surgeon. And so it was, the development of that, the knowledge and the capability, the skills and the resources down to that lowest level, which genuinely started saving lives. And that's what we're seeing. We don't necessarily need more therapists, more psychiatrists. Now, clearly, NHS mental health waiting lists are quite long, so that wouldn't be a bad thing. But actually far better that everybody, down to the lowest level, has the knowledge, the skills, the resources, the confidence to protect their mental health, to feel like they're allowed to feel like they are allowed to talk to people, to get this stuff out there, to realise that they're not alone. And so that's, for me, what success would look like, is giving people that knowledge, that feeling of freedom and confidence to explore these things.
So back to your story, that's really about democratizing people's sense of ownership and ability to take hold of the risk factors and the protective factors in a way that is positive for them. And back to that idea of time-based permission, if people feel they don't have it, that's when, on a daily basis, they tend not to take ownership of their ability to influence those risk and protective factors. And it's potentially really, really powerful.
Yeah, or they use what time resources they have to adopt unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Absolutely.
Which we are, again, as humans, we're quite often wired to do, aren't we? So when we get stressed, we tend to want to eat high-fat, high-sugar foods because our body's telling us that we're not sure when we're going to eat again, or we're going to have to run away. So I start eating donuts when I'm depressed or I'm anxious.
Yeah. I was very good at that.
Yeah.
I tend to eat them when I'm happy.
Or I reach for the beers. I reach for the wine, actually, rather than... And so whilst we think that's a really good coping mechanism, and actually in moderation is fine, but realising that actually what we're probably better off doing is going for a walk, getting a bit of a connection with nature, or going and chatting to a friend. And so helping understand that it's perfectly natural to use these unhelpful things like bottling things up, drinking, taking drugs, all of those sorts of things. But actually, it's not going to help. Yeah. And having a degree of awareness to start off with, but also the encouragement, the peer support to break out of those cycles, and building that mental fitness routine alongside, maybe a physical fitness routine.
And a lot of those habits are, sadly, they're enjoyable, aren't they?
Very.
But it's back to that idea of dependence. If you recognise, and everyone can do this, if you recognise that either in the moment or on a regular basis you are dependent on alcohol, bags of donuts, McDonald's, in order to deal with short-term stress or emotional interference, that is actually a clue that you can pay attention to. Now, the alternative is potentially that you can you really master that sort of internal emotional regulation without the need for those external things. But we tend to reach for those external things because they're the obvious options when our body is saying stress is showing up, anxiety is showing up, you need something in order to work the problem short term.
And it's really available.
Yeah.
It's there in our consciousness, isn't it?
And actually,
McDonald's is never more than 5 miles away, apparently.
It's literally like 500 yards from our office as well.
Same here.
So it took me a long time to figure that out. That actually, society is, particularly from a retail perspective, it's set up to get you to buy in those moments, and use things that are ultimately unhelpful for your physical and your mental health. I went through the donut phase, but for other reasons, like immediate response, 5 bag of donuts. Went through the fatty food phase. This is when 5 years ago, tried to respond to my bad habits in a logical, deliberate way by training as a personal trainer. Started working as a personal trainer in the Link Centre. The irony was that I was terrible at it anyway. But the irony was that I got more fat and depressed when I was a personal trainer than before
Why do you
I
think that was?
because I'd latched onto, I built a picture in my mind of what success looked like in the short term.
Yeah.
It wasn't the right thing. I was unhappy in that role. It didn't really fit with my identity.
But yeah,
And
but
so
that was the
behaviours
part
continued.
of re-establishing some sense of identity.
Yeah,
Wasn't it?
yeah. So on paper, it was right to go after something in order to move forward. It just so happened I picked the wrong thing. I actually got caught by a client, having finished a session with her, coming out of McDonald's, having talked about healthy eating, like 2 minutes after a session. And it's a good job she didn't know what was in that bag, because that's when I was sort of stocking up with, 6 triple cheeseburgers or 4 Big Macs and 3 chips, and the cravings were out of control.
Yeah.
And then of course you realise I'm a complete fraud. This is inauthentic. Like, this is not the right thing for me. Time to go again.
Isn't it funny though? I think is it like a British cultural thing that in good times we turn to alcohol, in bad times we turn to alcohol. Oh, let's have a drink because you've just passed your driving test, or sadly, this,
and in the army,
17, perfect.
Have you done yours yet?
Yeah.
when we were growing up in the army, those formative years of our sort of 20s, that's absolutely it. But it was probably magnified even more. When things went well, we drank. When things went wrong, we drank.
In the field, when you were in Afghanistan, places like that, was there the most abstract ways of dealing with these things? If you were in
For
a
me,
field,
it was smoking. I don't smoke.
Everyone smokes when they're
After a firefight, after a contact, I'd be saying, right, lads, who's got a fag?
Really?
Yeah, because
And would the majority of you do that?
yeah.
Could you get alcohol on tour? Is that was it strict no?
Yeah. I mean, you just you tend to adapt to your environment, and of course, the way the forces provide for you in those situations are, when you're back in camp, the food's good, the gyms are there, you have a space to relax, even though it's still the middle of the desert. But what you have when you're out in the field, and I remember going out for in theory 12 hours, and therefore packed for 12 hours. We ended up being out on the ground for 3 weeks with no kit and so on. We've been resupplied out there, but because you have each other, but you're also in role in the zone, everyone's mind and mentality is focused on what you're trying to achieve.
And you could always just turn your pants inside out. So.
Then
Once,
to a certain extent, in those moments, that's all you need. You just need to know you've got the right people around you. So the idea of needing other stuff just goes out your thinking.
And in a way, I found being on tour the easiest thing, because you're not worrying about stuff that's going on at home. You're literally, you got the right people around you. You're focused on one thing, in many ways, that's why I think a lot of the negative mental impact of those sorts of experiences doesn't show up until a long time later. You rarely see it in the moment. It might be
the purpose.
It might be what we would call battle shock or something like that. Somebody is literally shocked into paralysis or whatever it is, but that quickly comes out. They then move on, and then it's not until you're back in camp, maybe amongst your family, maybe you are drinking, maybe it's 2, 3, 5 years later when actually all of these factors sort of come to surface.
Yeah, and I know this is a weird idea for us to say, actually, in a way that we felt lucky that we were able to go away with work for 6-7 months, focus on the job, and of course you're thinking about your family, etc., but you're not dealing with all that usual stuff that life brings you on a daily basis. You're not really distracted from your ability to do your job. And what we've got to recognise is that, that's why I have so much respect for the police, having worked with them, is that they experience potentially multiple traumatic incidents or experiences, particularly from a position they don't know what they're going into from one day to the next. They experience all that stuff during one working day, and then they're expected not only to go back and live a normal life, but there's not much time in order to process stuff, regather yourself, reset before you go again.
Yeah.
And then clearly that has the potential to have a degrading effect as you go through the career. So what I mean by being lucky is, we were away for 6-7 months having trained for that operation, and we were able to get in the zone without all those other things being part of that picture. And whether it's, the police, other elements of the emergency services or not, we've got to recognise that whatever it is that people do at work, they are going to have stressors and factors around stress that are difficult to deal with, and they bring home every night. So, we're all ultimately in the same position to a certain extent.
Yeah. My last question for you guys,
Yeah.
given what's going on in Eastern Europe, and I guess this is more of a question for you, Ollie, because Tim, you don't watch the news, which is probably something we should all do.
Or not do.
Yeah. How much of an impact do you think mental health and morale has on the battlefield? There was a retired British general who said morale is equally, if not more important than actual equipment you have as a military.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah. And, a motivated, well-led army, has the ability to, if not defeat, at least resist and wait out. A well-equipped, well-supported, but fundamentally unhappy, poorly led force. And I've seen that in a number of scenarios where I've deployed. Actually, morale, motivation, a sense of purpose is absolutely vital. Without that, no end of weapons is ultimately going to win you a war. And I think, you're seeing two very opposite cultures with the Russian forces, which are typically very, very hierarchical. You hear stories of a drone deployment having to be authorized by a general, whereas, the Ukrainians probably, it's probably a senior NCO saying, right, let's get that up there. So that's bred of some kind of insecurity, isn't it? That top-heavy hierarchical command structure. If you combine that with an obvious lack of care for the people who are in harm's way, what does that feel like to be a young Russian individual who possibly may be a conscript? If you don't want to be there in the first place, how hard are you going to fight? How committed are you going to be to that? You see, you will see desertions. You will see officers probably getting shot by their own soldiers.
Wow.
Probably not unrealistic. Whereas you see footage of Ukrainians who are literally fighting for their survival, singing their national anthem together as a unit before they then go in. They have psychological safety. They know that they've got each other's backs. They know that they are evicting people who have occupied their homeland, their villages. In the Russian army, I would suggest psychological safety is a pretty scarce commodity.
Yeah, and it's it's another example of the potential power of that interdependence. That really well-established, connected culture based on trust, shared values, shared beliefs, values alignment, and I think what we're seeing is two complete opposite scenarios in that space.
Yeah, and the Russian command and control structure is pretty flimsy. Their ability to sustain is not what it should be, what could be, what we thought it was. And it's a really interesting way it's playing out is that it's taken the shine off the might of the Russian forces. We always assumed that they would be a difficult foe. They're not easy. But it just shows that the moral component, which is what we would call it,
is huge.
Yeah. What is it? The physical component, the moral component, and there's another one I can't remember. It's been a while, but that moral component is absolutely vital, and that's why on the whole in the British Army it is good because they are volunteers. Broadly, people believe in what they are doing. Typically, we are mostly well led. Values are an important part of it. Usually, there are good relationships within units. That was certainly my experience. And those things count. They matter. When you're on a battlefield, it sounds a bit cliched to say it, but you're not fighting for Queen, now King and country. You're literally fighting for the people around you. And it does sound cliched, but it is absolutely true. Whereas actually what you're probably finding in the Russian army at the moment is that they're worried about being put on a charge or shot for desertion or all of these things. But also they don't want to be there in the first place. There is no belief in what they're doing. When they go back, whenever this finishes, they're probably not going to be well received by their country folk. Just imagine that, putting your life on the line, maybe being injured and going back.
Be forced to go.
Being forced to go and not being valued because actually nobody was really up for doing it in the first place.
Yeah, values alignment is really, really key. And just having this conversation, it's just clarified in my mind that I was lucky enough to join the military based upon values alignment. I felt that was a good fit. When I found myself in a different position, I was lucky enough again for us to form our organisation based upon values alignment. And, when it hasn't gone well for me, it's when I've tried to do something or I've joined an organisation where that values alignment is not in place. And you guys clearly will have values alignment when you set on this path. And you started Ottr.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's really, really key.
Do you think Russia's going to have, whenever this conflict ends, do you think Russia's going to have a severe problem with mental health at home because of what's happened?
Yeah, but it's not really, I don't want to generalise,
Sure.
but it's not really a thing in the Russian culture anyway, from what I can see. You probably wouldn't get much talk about psychological safety with Mr. Putin.
I don't think they'd be interested in Genesis.
But, no, exactly.
You're looking for an in, yeah.
Might be worth a go. Maybe their budgets are a bit tight at the moment. Yeah, I think massive, because you've got a huge amount of risk factors. Maybe you've got what we might call moral injury, which is essentially where people are psychologically affected when they've been forced to contravene their own ethical standards, their own moral standards. So I'd say that'd be a huge issue, because people are being asked to do, look at the amount of attacks on civilians that are going on. That will result in moral injury, a sense of shame, a sense of guilt, which compound possibly with post-traumatic impact. Yeah, I think it's, I can't think of many worse scenarios for people's mental health. Combine that maybe with a physical injury. It's a real powder keg there of terrible mental health, I would think. But to go back to the values alignment, you see that actually being on the right side of history, and this is a very Western-centric way of looking at it, starts to play out. So, you hear one Russian minister recently saying, we are no longer fighting Ukraine, we are now fighting NATO. Now, NATO does not have troops on the ground, certainly not declared anyway. But what they do have is they have the moral support. They are equipping them with weapons that can be decisive, which can shape the battlefield in a way that they might not have other, because we can see that an international norm, an international value has been compromised by Russia's actions there.
It's interesting. Gents, thanks so much for coming today. It's been an awesome
Pleasure.
podcast.
It's been fun.
We've enjoyed it, Dan, haven't we?
Yeah, I think it's really nice to speak to professionals or people who are openly talking about this and are also trying to help other people.
Anyway.
So yeah, it's been really great chatting to you both.
Good. Well, thank you for having
Cheers,
us.
guys.
Thanks, guys.